Police laugh at a homeless veteran's complaint. Moments later, they realize he leads their corruption investigation. In a city where trust in the police was shattered by corruption, one homeless veteran's quiet voice sparked a movement that no one saw coming. Dismissed, laughed at, and overlooked, Harold Finch carried a past few could imagine, a decorated Navy SEAL whose courage extended far beyond the battlefield. When he confronted the very officers who once betrayed the badge, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was exposing a web of lies and reclaiming justice for a community betrayed by those sworn to protect it. And before I forget, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. I guarantee you won't want to miss it. Now let's jump in. The morning air was cold, pressing against the worn jacket of a man who had grown used to the chill. He sat on a splintered bench outside the downtown police precinct, his back straight, his gaze low. His name was Harold Finch, though few bothered to ask. Most people simply called him the homeless guy on 7th Street. Harold wasn't panhandling. He never asked for spare change. Most days, he simply sat in the same spot, quietly observing the rhythm of a city that had long since passed him by. Commuters in pressed suits, officers in crisp uniforms. None of them gave him a second glance. To them, he was invisible. But on this particular morning, Harold's hands trembled slightly as he gripped a folded document. A complaint, meticulously written, detailing the quiet bleeding of corruption within the very walls of the precinct behind him. Names, dates, transactions, nothing speculative, all cold, documented truth. He'd gathered the information over months. Quietly, patiently, watching, listening. Not that they would listen to him. When Harold finally stepped inside, the officers at the front desk barely concealed their disdain. A younger officer, badge gleaming, leaned back in his chair and smirked. Back again, huh? What is it this time? Did someone steal your shopping cart? The room chuckled. The senior sergeant glanced up from his paperwork, his voice dry. Go on, let him have his little speech. It's good entertainment. Harold's voice didn't rise. It remained steady, though the weight behind it could have silenced the entire room had they been listening for something more than their own amusement. I'd like to file a formal complaint, he said, carefully unfolding the document. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the years that had worn on his joints. It concerns officers in this precinct. Multiple counts of extortion, witness suppression, and direct involvement in narcotics distribution. The younger officer laughed openly now. Oh, that's rich. The street guys solving crimes now. Someone call Hollywood. Harold placed the paper on the desk, smoothing its edges with deliberate care. You'll find everything you need there. His jacket, frayed at the cuffs, shifted slightly as he moved. For the briefest moment, something metallic caught the light. Dog tags, worn thin, tucked beneath his shirt. But they didn't see it. Or maybe they chose not to. Look, old man. The sergeant sighed, standing and crossing his arms. How many times do we have to tell you? This isn't a lost and found for your conspiracy theories. File another fake complaint, and I'll have you removed from the premises. Got it. Harold met his gaze, steady and calm. I understand. The younger officer waved him off. Go back to your bench, hero. And Harold did. But he left the document behind. By the time they realized who Harold Finch really was, and why that complaint bore the watermark of the Department of Justice, it would already be too late to laugh. The document sat untouched on the front desk for hours. Coffee cups came and went. Papers were shuffled. Nobody cared to read it. It wasn't until Officer Reynolds, the precinct's administrative aide, began his usual paperwork sweep that his eyes drifted over the words. At first, he skimmed it, expecting the usual ramblings he'd seen from Harold before. But the language, the detail, it didn't feel like the scattered notes of a desperate man. It read like a dossier. Clean, structured, methodical. His brow furrowed as he flipped to the second page. Then the third. Attached were bank records, photographs, dates that aligned with known criminal operations, names he recognized, names of people he worked with. His stomach tightened. He called Sergeant Daniels over with a nervous laugh, trying to brush it off. You gotta see this. The homeless guy's gone full detective. But as Daniels read through the file, his face drained of color. The bank accounts were real. The transfer dates matched internal movements. There were surveillance photos, confidential case numbers that had never gone public. How the hell did he get this? Daniels whispered, flipping faster, panic rising beneath his forced calm. Reynolds tried to brush it off. Must have picked it out of the trash. Got lucky. Daniels wasn't convinced. In the far corner, Lieutenant Sanders, a man whose name appeared more than once in Harold's document, sat up, listening now. The tension in the room thickened. Pull his file, Daniels ordered quietly. Reynolds hesitated. He's homeless. He's just. Pull it. Reynolds tapped into the system, running Harold's name. What came back didn't make sense. There was no criminal record, no outstanding warrants. But there was something else, a flag notice. Department of Defense. Clearance level, classified. His mouth went dry. He dug deeper, accessing archived personnel files. When the screen loaded, Reynolds felt the weight of every careless word he'd spoken that morning. Harold Finch. Rank, Chief Petty Officer. Branch, United States Navy SEALs. Service record, 27 years. Multiple deployments. Counterterrorism. Black Site operations. Commendations, Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Navy Cross. Status, retired. Current affiliation, Department of Justice, Special Investigations Unit, active consultant. Reynolds swallowed hard. Daniels leaned in, his voice low and sharp. Tell me this isn't real. But it was. The man they'd mocked, dismissed, and shoved out the door wasn't just a veteran. He was a warfighter. And according to the clearance stamp on his file, he wasn't operating alone. Lieutenant Sanders rose from his desk, his composure cracking. Find him. Now. Outside, Harold sat calmly on his bench, folding an old newspaper. His breath steady, his mind quiet. Across the street, in an unmarked car, two men sat watching him. No uniforms, no badges, just quiet professionals. Waiting. The precinct erupted into motion, but it was not the loud scramble of sirens or the hurried clatter of boots on pavement. No, this was a quieter panic, a tightening of collars, a flurry of hushed phone calls, eyes darting to corners of the room where security cameras watched silently. Lieutenant Sanders retreated to his office and slammed the door, the weight of the file trembling in his hands. He dialed a number he knew too well. This is Sanders. We've got a problem. The voice on the other end was low, clipped. What kind? A man. Name's Harold Finch. He just walked in here and dropped a complaint with classified level intel on our operations. There was a pause, a dangerous one. That name came up last month. DOJ's Special Investigations Unit flagged him. We thought it was dormant. It's not, Sanders whispered. He's sitting across the street right now, like he's waiting for us to figure it out. On the other end, the voice shifted, steel hard now. You leave him alone. He's not your problem anymore. Sanders stiffened. But I said leave. Him. Alone. The line went dead. Sanders sat back in his chair, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew the weight of those words. They didn't come from local brass. They came from the federal level, operatives who didn't explain themselves. Across the street, Harold remained unmoved, as if the morning's humiliation had slid off him like rain on stone. His gaze drifted to the quiet sedan parked half a block down. The men inside weren't watching him anymore. They were waiting on him. The documents he had submitted were not a cry for help. They were a formal delivery. Harold rose from the bench with deliberate ease, each movement steady but heavy, like a man used to carrying weight no one else could see. His boots, though scuffed, were laced with military precision. His gait, while slower than in his prime, still held the ghost of discipline in every step. As he walked away, the two men in the sedan stepped out, falling in behind him at a respectful distance. They didn't approach. They simply followed, as if escorting a man of importance whose dignity had been overlooked by a world too busy to care. Inside the precinct, Sergeant Daniels sat in stunned silence as Reynolds whispered, We laughed at him. Daniels clenched his fists, but there was no fight left to summon. Only the bitter taste of realization. He had been here on official business. The gravity of what they'd dismissed began to settle like dust in the back of their throats. Back on the street, Harold turned a corner, his destination quiet and unremarkable, a small church where the pastor knew him by name. Inside, Harold found a seat at the back, lowering himself carefully onto the wooden pew. The silence was comforting here. No judgments, no titles, just the sound of distant traffic and the soft creak of old wood. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something he rarely touched, a folded photograph. A woman and a little girl, both smiling. Both gone. He traced the edge of the photo with a callous thumb. Soon he whispered. But he wasn't talking about revenge. He was talking about closure. Harold sat in the quiet church long after the last of the morning's visitors had gone. The silence wasn't empty to him. It was familiar. It was the kind of silence he'd known on cold nights during deployments, sitting watch while the world around him slept. The kind of silence where memory crept in, uninvited but unstoppable. His fingers lingered on the edges of the old photograph. His wife, Evelyn, holding their daughter, Grace. Smiles full of light. A life that had once grounded him. Gone. A drunk driver, a shattered windshield, and a letter from the local authorities, neatly folded with a generic note of sympathy. No one had been held accountable. The officer responsible had been shielded, protected by the same web of corruption Harold now investigated. His purpose had narrowed ever since. Not vengeance. Not violence. Truth. He tucked the photo carefully back into his jacket, rose, and nodded to the pastor on his way out. No words passed between them. None were needed. As Harold stepped onto the sidewalk, the two quiet men from the sedan approached, not hurried, not aggressive. One of them, a man named Cooper, spoke with the familiarity of an old colleague. "They know now," Cooper said, walking alongside Harold. "They finally read it." "They needed to," Harold replied softly. Cooper's partner, Jensen, glanced around cautiously. "Some of those names, they won't go quietly." "I'm not here for the noise," Harold said, steady. "I just want the truth to land where it's supposed to." Cooper smirked, not in mockery, but in quiet respect. "You always did play the long game." Harold didn't answer. His steps carried him toward the modest community center where he volunteered, unseen by most, essential to a few. There, he was known simply as Mr. Finch, the quiet man who fixed broken shelves, who swept the floor when no one else wanted to, who taught the neighborhood kids how to stand up straight and shake a hand with confidence. Inside, Maya, one of the teenagers Harold had quietly mentored, waved him over. "Hey, Mr. Finch, you coming to the rec game tonight? Coach said we're finally going to beat the North Side." Harold allowed the faintest smile. "I wouldn't miss it." He knelt to adjust a loose bolt on a bench while Maya chatted away, unaware that the man tightening screws with aged hands was the same man who had once defused explosives under enemy fire, who had rescued hostages in foreign jungles, who had buried comrades without fanfare. He had found in this quiet life a new mission, preserving dignity, creating small sanctuaries of honesty in a city where corruption rotted the foundations. But the storm he had set in motion was gathering speed. Lieutenant Sanders made another call that afternoon, not to federal contacts this time, but to men whose loyalty had been bought. "Find him. I don't care how. I don't care when. Just make sure Harold Finch doesn't walk into another precinct with anything else." Harold continued working, unaware, for now, that shadows were beginning to move against him. That evening, the neighborhood's small basketball court came alive under the flicker of aging floodlights. The chain nets rattled with each shot, the asphalt worn but familiar beneath the players' feet. Kids from both sides of the neighborhood gathered, their laughter and shouts filling the air. Harold stood by the sidelines, arms crossed, quietly watching. The people here didn't know his past. They didn't need to. To them, he was simply a steady presence, a man who showed up, who listened, who fixed what was broken. Maya dribbled past her defender, sunk a three-pointer, and glanced toward Harold for the silent nod she always chased. When it came, she grinned and sprinted back on defense. For Harold, moments like these were the quiet victories that mattered now. He had spent years in places where wins were measured in body counts and breathless escapes. Here, A nod of approval and the weight of community were enough. But the peace wasn't built to last. Across the street, two unmarked vehicles idled with their headlights off. Inside, men sent by Lieutenant Sanders watched the court, their orders sharp and simple. Locate Harold Finch, assess his daily patterns, and when the moment was right, make sure he disappeared without noise. They assumed this would be easy. After all, he was just a homeless old man. But men like Harold didn't forget how to notice when the rhythm of the street changed. He caught the wrong reflection in a shop window, noticed a car that hadn't moved in an hour, saw the faint glint of optics behind a half-closed newspaper. And just like that, he knew. The next day, Harold returned to his bench, just as they expected. Calm, deliberate. But this time, when he rose, he didn't walk his usual path. He led them, purposefully, through tight alleys, across crowded intersections, weaving through the morning markets. Cooper and Jensen watched from a distance, tracking the watchers. Finch is flushing them out, Cooper muttered, a note of reluctant admiration in his voice. Jensen nodded, pressing his earpiece. The ghost still sharp. At the end of his route, Harold ducked into a quiet cafe, taking a seat near the back. When the two men trailing him finally entered, they found him calmly sipping black coffee, his jacket folded neatly beside him. The younger of the two approached, trying to summon authority in his voice. "You've been causing problems, old man." Harold set his cup down slowly, his gaze level and utterly unshaken. "No, son. I've been solving them." The second man leaned in, lowering his voice. "We've been asked to make sure you stay out of this. Permanently." Harold's reply was simple, quiet. "You're not the first men to try." Before the tension could snap, the door chimed and Cooper entered, flashing his badge. One that bore no department name, just a seal and a serial number most men wouldn't recognize. "You're done here," Cooper said, his voice steady but firm. The two enforcers exchanged a glance, realizing too late they'd been walking into a corner they couldn't fight their way out of. They left without another word. Harold took another slow sip, savoring the silence that returned. The war wasn't over. But this battle, for now, was settled. And Harold would keep walking, one step at a time, toward the quiet justice he'd promised himself years ago. Back at the precinct, Lieutenant Sanders paced in the confines of his office, his frustration growing sharper with each report. The men he'd sent had returned empty-handed, visibly shaken. "He's not alone," one of them said, avoiding Sanders' eyes. "Federal types. Clean badges. No names." Sanders slammed his fist on the desk. "I told you to handle it quietly. We tried. But this isn't some guy ranting on the street." He knew we were following him. Sanders already knew what that meant. Harold Finch wasn't a name that would vanish under pressure. He wasn't someone to be shoved into silence. He was, and always had been, a man with reach. The rot in the precinct wasn't just an open secret. It was built into the walls. And now those walls were starting to crack. Sanders' phone buzzed. This time, it wasn't the voice from Washington. It was someone local, someone Sanders trusted less. "You're bleeding," the caller said without greeting. "I told you not to underestimate him." Sanders rubbed his forehead. "I didn't expect the DOJ to still have him working. He never stopped. Finch isn't retired. He's embedded. Quietly. Then why the act? The street bench, the rags?" The voice paused. "Because Harold Finch doesn't care about what you think of him. He cares about what's true. He's always been like that." The line went dead before Sanders could reply. Across town, Harold sat in his modest room above the community center. The space was small, clean, and almost military in its simplicity. A folded cot, a wooden chair, a shelf with a few worn paperbacks. The walls bore no decorations, just one small frame containing his Navy Cross and the photo of Evelyn and Grace. Beside it, his old team patch. The stitching had frayed, but the symbol remained clear, a quiet reminder of men who never came home. Cooper entered without knocking, carrying a sealed envelope. "Updates from DC Internal Affairs is moving faster now." Your file forced their hand. Harold didn't look up. "Names." Cooper handed him the list. It was longer than Harold had expected. Officers, administrators, even a judge, all tied to the same corruption web. Some Harold had suspected. Others were revelations. His finger hovered over one name in particular. Sergeant Daniels. Daniels was there when the reports were buried, Harold said quietly. He signed off on the accident that killed Evelyn and Grace. The man who ran that intersection drunk was one of theirs. Cooper's voice lowered. You sure you want to carry this weight? The system's moving. These men will be brought in. That's not enough, Harold said, his voice steady but firm. I need them to know. I need them to see me. They buried my family's truth, and they walked away untouched. Cooper understood. Some men fought their wars on foreign soil. Others fought them in the streets they called home. Harold folded the list carefully, slipping it into his jacket. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He was simply resolved. Tomorrow, he would return to the precinct, not as the man on the bench, but as the one who carried every unspoken truth to their doorstep. The next morning, the precinct buzzed as usual. Officers exchanged casual banter, coffee cups steamed on desks, and the rhythm of routine covered the building like a familiar blanket. No one expected disruption, especially not from the man they had dismissed days earlier. But when Harold Finch walked through the front doors, the air changed. He didn't wear the frayed jacket this time. His clothes were plain but pressed. His boots were clean. The dog tags that had once glinted faintly under his collar now rested purposefully over his shirt, visible, deliberate. His steps were unhurried, but there was no hesitation. The desk sergeant, the same man who'd mocked him before, froze mid-sentence as Harold approached. His mouth opened, but the words collapsed under the weight of recognition. His gaze flicked to the tags, the posture, the calm presence of a man who had seen wars and walked through them. You, the sergeant whispered, suddenly unsure of what he was supposed to say. Harold didn't stop at the desk. He moved past him, past the waiting civilians, past the officers who turned at the sudden silence trailing behind him. His footsteps echoed against the tiled floor, a slow, deliberate rhythm that drew every eye. Lieutenant Sanders stepped out of his office, his composure cracking as Harold walked straight toward him, the list folded neatly in his hand. Finch, Sanders began, forcing a tight smile. This isn't the place. Harold handed him the list without a word. Sanders' hand trembled slightly as he took it, unfolding it to see the names, his, Daniels, the judge, the officers he had shielded. The room was quiet now, a crowd forming as officers and staff realized something was unfolding that didn't fit their daily pattern. You should have shredded those files when you had the chance, Harold said, his voice calm, low, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Sanders forced a hollow laugh. You've got nothing. No authority. Harold's reply was almost a whisper. You might want to check with your captain. On cue, the precinct's captain appeared, flanked by 2 federal agents and Cooper, who now wore the badge openly. The captain's face was grim, his eyes locking onto Sanders with the weight of an impending reckoning. Lieutenant Sanders, the captain called, his voice cold and formal. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. The weight of the room shifted violently. Daniels stepped forward, panic creeping into his voice. This is a mistake. You're going to believe a street guy over your own men. The captain didn't flinch. I'm believing the federal investigation that's been building around this department for the last year. I'm believing the corroborated evidence delivered by Chief Petty Officer Harold Finch, United States Navy SEAL, Special Investigations Consultant. Daniel's mouth hung open, the color draining from his face. The title hit the room like a thunderclap. Harold stood there, motionless, as the agents began moving in, cuffing the officers whose corruption had rotted the precinct from the inside. There was no shouting, no fight, just the quiet collapse of a system that thought itself untouchable. Harold didn't stay to watch it all unfold. He turned, walked past the stunned officers and civilians, and stepped back into the cold morning air. Outside, Maya waited, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered one, casually, like nothing had happened. You coming to the game tonight? She asked, her voice light. Harold accepted the cup with a faint nod. Wouldn't miss it. And with that, he kept walking. News of the arrests traveled faster than Harold expected. By midday, headlines rippled through the city. Corruption ring exposed within downtown precinct. Federal investigation tied to decorated Navy SEAL consultant. Lieutenant Sanders and several officers in custody. But Harold wasn't reading the papers. He didn't need to. His work was never about headlines. It was about the quiet correction of what had gone wrong. Still, the city's perception was shifting. People who had ignored him on the street now stole glances his way. Some offered cautious nods. Others, recognizing his face from grainy news photos, whispered his name as he passed. The man they had dismissed was no longer invisible. But Harold had no appetite for public attention. He spent the afternoon back at the community center, repairing a broken cabinet in the supply room, sweeping the gym floor, restocking the equipment closet. The ordinary things. The things that kept him steady. Cooper visited briefly, leaning against the doorway as Harold worked. "They wanted you on the press conference stage," Cooper said, half amused. "I said no," Harold replied, not looking up. "Figured." Harold tightened the last screw in the cabinet, wiped his hands on a rag, and stood. This was never about public recognition. It was about stopping them. Cooper's expression softened. "You did more than stop them. You broke the chain. The precinct's getting cleaned out. Cases they buried are resurfacing. Some victims' families might finally get answers." Harold's jaw tightened slightly at that. It would never bring Evelyn and Grace back, but maybe, just maybe, it would keep someone else's family whole. Cooper handed Harold a small envelope. Inside was a sealed letter. "From the DOJ," Cooper explained. "They're offering you a full reinstatement. New role. Clean desk. Fresh start." Harold stared at the envelope but didn't open it. "I'm not going back," he said. Cooper nodded, already expecting the answer. "Why not?" "I found my place," Harold said simply, glancing toward the distant sounds of kids playing basketball. "Here. Doing the small things that matter. Quiet work." "You're sure?" "I've spent my life cleaning messes for people who didn't want to face the truth. Now I just want to build something that doesn't need to be cleaned." Cooper's smirk softened into respect. "You always were stubborn." Harold folded the envelope carefully and set it aside. "You tell them I said thank you. But I've got what I need." As Cooper left, Maya appeared in the doorway. "You coming to practice?" she asked. Harold grabbed his jacket, the dog tag slipping beneath his collar once more, hidden but never gone. "Lead the way." That evening, as he watched Maya and the other kids running drills, Harold allowed himself something rare, a quiet moment of contentment. No medals, no speeches, no grand closing chapter. Just the steady hum of life moving forward, and a man who had finally found peace in the smallest, most ordinary victories. The system he had challenged would continue to shift, long after his name faded from the news. And that was enough. Later that night, when the streets had grown quiet and the city lights shimmered against the rain-soaked pavement, Harold sat alone in his small room above the community center. His jacket hung neatly on the chair, his boots resting by the door, their laces carefully arranged, a habit he never abandoned. The dog tags lay on the table in front of him. He turned them over slowly between his fingers, tracing the worn edges. The names, the blood types, the echoes of friends long gone. Harold had never been the type to talk to ghosts, but tonight the weight of memory settled heavy on his shoulders. Faces he hadn't seen in years drifted through his mind. Brooks, Ramirez, Dalton, men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in places no one else dared to go. Places no one else would ever know. He pulled a small, leather-bound journal from his nightstand. It was nearly full now, each page carrying the story of a man who had spent decades living in the margins, between wars, between identities, between the life he had built and the one that had been taken from him. On the next page, he wrote, "Evelyn, Grace, today was for you." His pen hovered for a moment, then moved again. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of a door finally closing behind the right people. There were other names to write now. He listed Sanders, Daniels, the officers whose chains had finally unraveled. When he finished, he closed the journal, pressing his palm against the cover, as if grounding the weight of it all. There was no satisfaction in it, just a quiet relief that the stone had finally been lifted. The next morning, the precinct went through its first full day under new leadership. Officers who had long kept their heads down began speaking openly. Files once buried were reopened. People Harold would never meet began to feel the ripple of his work. But Harold stayed distant from all of it. No interviews. No acknowledgments. He returned to his bench, this time not as an outsider, but as a part of the neighborhood's fabric. Maya approached during lunch, holding 2 sandwiches. "You're really not going back?" she asked, handing him one. Harold shook his head. "There's work here. More important work. You could have been in those news stories. You could have been on TV." He glanced at her with the faintest smile. "Not everything that matters belongs on a screen." She sat beside him, swinging her legs over the side of the bench. "Coach says you've been training us like soldiers." Harold's eyes softened. "I just want you to know how to stand up for yourselves." Maya looked down at the sandwich in her hands, her voice quiet now. "You think I can be strong like you?" Harold took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "You already are." And in that quiet exchange, he knew the next generation wouldn't need men like him to carry the burden forever. They were already learning to carry it themselves. While Harold quietly continued his life in the neighborhood, the legal gears downtown kept turning. Depositions were underway, files were being audited, and officers previously deemed untouchable now sat under fluorescent lights in federal interview rooms. But there was still one thread left unpulled. Judge Whitaker. His name had been buried deeper than the others. Harold had uncovered the link only recently. A pattern of dismissed cases, falsified documents, and direct intervention that shielded the very officers now sitting in federal custody. Harold knew Whitaker wouldn't go quietly. Unlike Sanders and Daniels, the judge had money, power, and enough influence to pivot the narrative before it fully landed on him. Cooper delivered the update one afternoon, finding Harold at the edge of the basketball court, watching Maya and her friends practice. "Whitaker's making moves," Cooper said, his voice low. "Pulling favors. Trying to scrub his name off the record before it sticks." Harold's eyes didn't leave the court. "Then we make it stick." Cooper handed over a folder, a thin one this time. A photograph of Whitaker. Logs of sealed meetings. Patterns. "We've got enough to put him in a corner," Cooper said. "But he's got reach. He'll lean on the press, call in favors, stall the process. You sure you want to push this one? You could step away now. No one would blame you." Harold's jaw tightened slightly. "If I step away now, Evelyn and Grace stay a footnote in a sealed report. That's not justice." Cooper nodded, the unspoken respect between them hanging steady. The next day, Harold walked into the courthouse, not as an official agent, not as a consultant, as a citizen, as a husband, as a father. He filed the final affidavit personally, bypassing precinct channels. The document bore the DOJ watermark, but more importantly, it carried his signature. His real name. No aliases. No operational covers. Harold Finch. The clerk accepted it, unaware of the decades carried in the ink of that signature. Later, as Harold sat on his usual bench, the courthouse doors opened across the street. Judge Whitaker stepped outside, flanked by security and advisors, his face tight with frustration. He spotted Harold immediately, his gaze narrowing with recognition. Harold didn't flinch. He didn't rise. He simply tipped his head in a silent acknowledgement. A message passed between them without a word spoken. "You're seen, and you'll answer." Whitaker turned sharply and walked away, but Harold knew it was over. The paper trail was too clean, the evidence too precise. The noose had already tightened. Some victories didn't need an audience. That evening, Harold returned to the community center. The kids were playing late under the soft hum of the floodlights. Maya jogged over, holding a notebook. "Hey, you still helping me with that essay?" she asked, breathless. "Of course," Harold said, taking a seat on the bench beside her. "What's the topic again?" She grinned. "Someone I look up to." Harold chuckled softly, but said nothing. In the quiet, he felt it, a rare thing. Closure. Days turned into weeks, but the ripples of Harold's truth spread steadily through the city. The media that had once dismissed him as a homeless complainer now gave cautious attention to the story of the veteran who had exposed the deepest corruption within the police precinct. Headlines shifted from skepticism to sober recognition, yet Harold himself remained a ghost in the background. Interviews were arranged, reporters reached out, but he declined them all. To Harold, the story was never about personal glory or public applause. It was about justice and healing for a broken system. At the community center, Harold's presence grew organically. The man once ignored on the street was now quietly central to the neighborhood's heartbeat. Children sought him out not because of his fame, but because of his steady, patient way of listening. Volunteers arrived, inspired by the invisible work he had been doing for years, repairing broken shelves, coaching kids in basic discipline and respect, and showing by example how to stand tall in the face of hardship. His influence was subtle but powerful, a living lesson in resilience, humility, and unwavering integrity. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor, a figure entered the center, a young woman in a crisp, clean uniform. Her steps were measured but carried a respectful purpose. She approached Harold, who was busy organizing supplies, and spoke with quiet reverence. "Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice steady but warm. Harold looked up, his calm eyes meeting hers. "Yes, I'm Lieutenant Harper," she introduced herself, pulling out a small, official-looking envelope. "On behalf of the department, and with the blessing of the federal task force, I wanted to personally thank you. Your evidence and testimony have ignited a much-needed purge of corruption. The cleanup is underway." Harold took the envelope slowly, as though it contained something fragile and precious. Inside was a letter of commendation, formal, carefully worded, and surprisingly meaningful to a man who had long since abandoned the pursuit of medals or ribbons. The letter acknowledged his bravery, his commitment to truth, and his unyielding courage to stand up against the rot that had undermined justice. A faint smile crossed Harold's lips. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years lived in silence. "But this isn't about me. It's about all the people who suffered because others chose to stay silent." Lieutenant Harper nodded, her gaze sincere. "We're dedicated to making things right. And, if you ever consider rejoining officially, we'd be honored to have you. You've got the respect of this community, and you bring something this department desperately needs." Harold's eyes drifted toward the bustling center. Kids laughing and playing basketball, volunteers organizing supplies, neighbors sharing quiet conversations. This was his mission now, to build something stronger, something unbreakable, from the ground up. "I'm not interested in titles or official roles," Harold replied gently. "But I am committed to truth and service, wherever that takes me." Lieutenant Harper smiled, understanding the quiet dignity in his words. "That's where all good work begins." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a warm golden glow across the streets, Harold walked home along familiar paths. He passed the old bench where, not long ago, he had sat unnoticed and unheard, a man invisible to the world. He stopped and reached out, running his fingers along the rough wood. The bench bore the scars of countless seasons, just as he bore the marks of countless battles, both visible and hidden. In that moment, the bench wasn't just a place to rest. It was a symbol of endurance. Harold closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of a lifetime of stories, loss, sacrifice, pain, and perseverance. He thought of Evelyn and Grace, of comrades lost and battles fought. And beneath it all, the quiet strength of a man who never stopped standing, even when no one was watching. In the stillness, Harold found peace, not in recognition, but in the honor of a life lived with unwavering purpose. The world might have overlooked him for years, but now, finally, he walked with the dignity he had earned. And that was enough. In the weeks following the upheaval at the precinct, Harold found that the world around him was quietly changing, not just in the justice system, but in the small, everyday connections that had always sustained him. One crisp morning, as the sun painted the neighborhood in soft gold, Harold was greeted by a familiar voice calling out his name. He turned to see an older man approaching with a measured step, a face weathered by time, but unmistakably steady. It was Colonel James Whitaker, Harold's former commanding officer from their years in special operations. They hadn't spoken in a long time, not since the deployments that had changed them both, and certainly not since Harold had slipped from the military world into obscurity. "Harold," The colonel said, extending a hand that Harold shook firmly. "I heard about what you did. I'm proud of you." Harold's eyes softened with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Colonel." They walked slowly to a nearby bench, the weight of shared history settling between them like an old, familiar cloak. "People forget what we've been through," Whitaker said quietly. "They forget what it means to serve. But you remind them, not with noise or medals, but with quiet strength." Harold nodded. "It's not about reminding them. It's about standing for something, no matter how invisible the fight." Whitaker studied him a moment. "Your family would be proud. You made sure their truth was heard." Harold's throat tightened, and he looked away briefly. "I just wish I could have done more. For them. For all of us." Whitaker's hand rested on Harold's shoulder, a steadying presence. "You did more than you know. You carried their memory. You carried ours. That's the heaviest burden of all." As they sat there, watching the neighborhood come alive with children laughing and neighbors greeting one another, Harold felt something rare, a sense of belonging not tied to rank or duty, but to shared respect and enduring bonds. Later that day, Maya stopped by with a handful of homemade cookies, offering them with a shy smile. "Thought you might like these," she said. "Coach says you're like a dad to us." Harold chuckled softly, accepting the gift. "I'm honored." She looked up with wide eyes. "Do you think I could be like you someday?" Harold took a slow breath, looking out at the sunset painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. "You already are," he said quietly. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had become his family, Harold knew that the battles he'd fought, the losses he'd endured, and the truths he'd uncovered had not been in vain. The man who had once been invisible had become a quiet pillar, not just for a neighborhood, but for a legacy of honor that would live on. Though the corruption within the precinct had been exposed and many of the guilty removed, the aftermath revealed how deeply rooted the problem had been. The city's justice system was fractured, and the work of rebuilding would be slow and painstaking. For every name brought to light, there were still countless shadows lurking in the corners, quiet alliances, hidden agendas, and silenced victims. Harold observed this from his quiet vantage point, aware that true change rarely comes quickly or easily. It takes patience, vigilance, and the steady commitment of those who refuse to look away or give up. He understood this better than most, having fought battles that spanned decades and continents. The war against corruption was no different. One evening, as twilight settled over the city like a soft cloak, Harold's phone buzzed. It was Lieutenant Harper. "We're uncovering more." Her voice was low but steady. "There are still shadows that haven't yet seen the light." Harold's reply was calm, but firm. "Then we keep digging. One name, one case, one truth at a time. We don't stop until the rot is gone." The fight was far from over. But Harold was no longer alone. Inspired by his courage, a new generation of honest officers were stepping forward. Officers determined to clean the system from within. Back at the community center, Harold remained a steady presence. His lessons extended beyond basketball drills. He taught the kids about respect, resilience, and the strength it takes to stand for what is right, even when the world pushes back. One afternoon, a young man named Carlos approached him after practice. Carlos struggled with anger, frustration, and the weight of growing up in a neighborhood shadowed by violence. "Mr. Finch," Carlos said hesitantly, "how do you keep going when it feels like the world is against you? When nothing seems to change?" Harold met his gaze with steady eyes. "Because some battles aren't won with fists or guns. They're won by holding on to your truth, no matter what. By staying true to yourself, even when no one else sees." Carlos nodded slowly, as if something inside him had shifted. As the sun set behind the city skyline, Harold returned once again to the bench he'd come to know so well. The streets buzzed softly around him, a reminder that life continued, complex, flawed, but full of fragile hope. He touched the cold dog tags beneath his collar, grounding himself in the weight of memory and purpose. For Harold Finch, the fight was not a thing of the past. It was a promise to keep moving forward, to keep standing tall, and to never, ever be forgotten. Months passed since the storm had broken over the precinct, and the city began to breathe differently, slowly, quietly, but with a renewed sense of hope. The precinct that once symbolized corruption and decay was now in the early stages of restoration. Not just the peeling paint and dimly lit hallways, but the very spirit of the place was changing. New leadership, chosen carefully for their integrity, took root. Officers who had spent years in the shadows stepped forward with courage. Transparency became more than a word, it became policy. Community meetings were held, voices long silenced were heard, and trust began to grow where suspicion had once festered. Harold remained a steady, silent presence in the neighborhood. He never sought praise or recognition for what he had done. In fact, he avoided the spotlight altogether. His satisfaction came from the small moments. A parent nodding respectfully as he passed, a child's shy smile as they learned to stand a little taller, a neighbor offering a quiet word of thanks. It was in these fragments of everyday life that Harold found his purpose renewed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Harold was at the community center repairing a worn bench when a group of veterans arrived. Word of his work had spread quietly through old networks, and they had come to offer their support. Among them was Captain Riley, a fellow Navy SEAL who had served alongside Harold many years before. "Harold," Riley said warmly, clasping his shoulder firmly, "what you've done for this city, and for us, it's more than we can ever repay." Harold's eyes softened, touched by the respect but quick to deflect. "We all carry our own battles," he replied quietly. "Some are fought on foreign soil, others in the streets we call home. It's good to know we can fight some of them together now." The veterans stayed for hours, sharing stories both light and heavy, laughter and moments of silent reflection. It was a powerful reminder that even in silence, the bonds forged in hardship endured unbroken. Later that evening, as twilight deepened, Harold returned to his bench, the same worn wood he had come to know as a place of rest and reflection. The gentle breeze stirred fallen leaves, carrying distant sounds of children playing, neighbors greeting one another. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small photograph, Evelyn and Grace, frozen in a moment of happiness and love. His fingers traced their faces with a steady, weathered hand. Though the past held its pain, it also fueled his resolve. The fight for justice, for dignity, for truth, was never truly over. Harold Finch rose from the bench, shoulders squared, eyes clear. He was more than a veteran, more than the man once overlooked and forgotten. He was a guardian of quiet honor, a keeper of truth, and his legacy would live on, not in headlines or medals, but in every life he had touched and every small victory he quietly nurtured. With the city slowly beginning to mend, Harold found himself settling into a new kind of rhythm, one not defined by the intensity of past conflicts, but by the steady, quiet pulse of everyday life. The community center had become more than just a building. It was a sanctuary, a place where hope was built piece by piece, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of kindness, courage, and consistency. Each morning, long before the neighborhood stirred, Harold was already there. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of worn wood and paint. He moved deliberately, checking the basketball court for cracks, tightening loose bolts on benches, arranging chairs with care. His hands, once steady on the battlefield, were now steady in these humble tasks. The laughter of children echoed through the halls, accompanied by the familiar scrape of sneakers and the occasional encouraging word from Harold's calm, measured voice. Though he never spoke openly about his past, the lessons he gave to the kids carried the weight of a life forged in hardship and discipline. He taught them about resilience, respect, and the quiet strength it takes to keep moving forward when the world feels heavy. His presence was a living example of endurance without bitterness, strength without aggression. One afternoon, a local reporter came by, eager to capture the story of the man who had quietly become a pillar of the neighborhood. Harold politely declined a formal interview, but offered instead a simple message. True strength isn't about loud victories or medals. It's found in the quiet moments, the everyday choices to stand up, to show up, and to keep going even when no one's watching. Those words, spoken softly but firmly, resonated far beyond the community center's walls. They touched the hearts of many who felt invisible, overlooked, or forgotten. As the seasons shifted, Harold's steady presence became a symbol of resilience for the neighborhood, a reminder that honor isn't measured by applause or recognition, but by integrity, humility, and the courage to carry on quietly. Sitting once again on his worn bench as the evening light softened around him, Harold allowed himself a rare, small smile. The journey had been long, marked by pain and sacrifice, but it had led him here, to a place where past and present converged in quiet dignity. Reaching beneath his collar, he felt the familiar cold weight of his dog tags, a silent testament to a life lived with purpose. Harold Finch was no longer just a man who fought battles abroad. He had become a guardian of his community, a beacon of hope in a world often too noisy to hear the quiet strength within. And in that stillness, he had found his greatest power. The days that followed carried a steady calm, quiet victories born not from loud fanfare, but from patience, honor, and unwavering truth. The city, battered but resilient, began to reclaim its soul. The precinct that once embodied decay and corruption was transforming into a beacon of integrity and hope. It was no longer just a place of law enforcement. It was a symbol of renewal and accountability. Harold observed these changes from the periphery, content to remain in the shadows. He never sought the spotlight or accolades. His work, uncovering the rot beneath the surface and shining a light on hidden wrongs, had set in motion a movement bigger than himself. The real victory was in the slow, steady rebuilding of trust between a community and those sworn to protect it. One late afternoon, as the sun hung low and cast warm amber light across the neighborhood, Harold was surprised by a visitor at his door. Maya stood there, clutching a small bundle wrapped carefully in worn cloth. Her eyes held a quiet excitement mixed with respect. "Coach," she said softly, extending the package, "this is for you." Harold took the bundle gently, careful not to rush the moment. He unwrapped it to reveal a faded photograph, an image of him years earlier, standing in uniform alongside his team. Faces filled with determination, brotherhood, and quiet courage stared back at him. Maya explained, "I found this among my mom's things. She said you should have it." Harold's eyes glistened with emotion he rarely displayed. "Thank you, Maya. This means more than words can say." He folded the photograph reverently and placed it next to the dog tags he wore beneath his collar, silent tokens of a life devoted to service, sacrifice, and resilience. Stepping outside into the soft glow of twilight, Harold took a slow breath. The neighborhood buzzed gently around him, children laughing, neighbors sharing stories, the warmth of a community knitting itself together once more. He walked to the old bench where so many days had begun and ended, sinking down into its familiar wood. He let the weight of the years settle, not as a burden, but as proof of a journey lived with purpose. The man once invisible had come full circle. He had faced darkness and emerged not with anger or violence, but with quiet strength, humility, and unwavering honor. Harold Finch's story was no longer just his own. It was woven into the very fabric of a community that had learned to stand tall alongside him. And in that shared strength, there was hope. A hope that no matter how deep the shadows, the light of truth and dignity will always find a way to shine through. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive tactical stories.